This is Breaking Down Security, and I'm Brian Brake. Welcome back, listener, for the new year, 2016. This is the very first episode of the new Breaking Down not the new Breaking Down Security, but new season of Breaking Down Security. Since I've stepped all over the intro here, I'm going to introduce Mr. Betcher, who will do a far better job than I will.
Hello, Brian. So this is 2016-001, eh?
Yes, it is. Smart arse. So, yeah, we're actually doing this in the past because we need a buffer. So for production values and making sure that, we're not all hungover trying to do a podcast. So for many of you who listen to the podcast, about a month ago, we did a podcast on BSIMM, which was Building Security and Maturity Model. We talked a little bit about it. We didn't go through the whole thing because it's a vast repository of framework knowledge that can be used to implement, secure measures in your environment. And I was trying to get a hold of some of the people who wrote it. It comes from a company called Cigital. But we found a consultant who works for a security company as well who offered to come on. So I want to welcome Jay Schulmann to the show.
Hey, thanks, guys. Great to be here.
Right on. So, Jay, why don't for the first episode of 2016 here, why don't you tell us a little bit about your origin story, where you came from, how you came to be working in the industry?
Yeah, so probably going back 15 years ago, I was a system and network guy who just ended up doing a whole lot of security stuff and just loved it. It was so much more fun than maintaining systems and networks. And so I kind of have worked in both consulting and for companies for the past couple of years, and spent the last 4 years working with BSIMM, which is, I think, what we'll talk about a lot today. And then, kind of on the side, which is, I think, how we got connected originally, is I run this website, jschulman.com, where I'm really trying to help people grow their own career, whether that's, fresh out of college, how do I get started, or people who are kind of in the middle looking to move up further.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. So I'm going to let Mr. Betcher have the first real question for BSIMM.
Well, Jay,
start with a softball, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So give us a rundown, since you're thoroughly integrated mentally with BSIMM. Give us a rundown on what BSIMM is and, why it is.
Sure, absolutely. So if you go back, we're about 5 years in to the whole BSIMM thing, and if you go back and think about it, it really started with this idea of what are organizations doing around application security. So it was never this is what you should do. It was very much what are people doing, and let's go document it. And that started with just a handful of companies. And I think, if you go to bsim.com, you'll see it's somewhere in the 70s and growing rapidly. And what's really interesting about it is it's not professing to say, this is what you should do. It's really saying, hey, this is what other people out there are doing. And statistically, that helps you a lot. So the one interesting part for me is, if you look at the data, I'm doing something, whatever it is, I'm doing something. Are other people doing that? You go and look at the data and say, oh yeah, other people are doing that. And I'm doing something, and I go look at the data and nobody's doing that. Well, gosh, should I still be doing that? Am I doing the right thing if nobody else in this industry is doing that? For some companies, absolutely, right? If you are unique, you should still be doing it. And so it really kind of gives you that concept of, and I don't like to use the word benchmark, but it gives you that concept of what are other people doing that really helps you enable your program.
Okay. And the idea is you've got so many controls, and so do you classify, the best thing would be, how do you classify yourself, right? If you're a financial, you'd want to do everything the financial folks are doing, or would you want to see what other companies are doing and try to see if that would work in your sector, even if it wasn't a financial sector?
I mean, great point. So it actually, if you go back to the origins, it started with this idea that the banks were saying, "Oh, we are nothing like the software companies. Don't even compare us to the software companies because we're nothing like them." And the software companies were saying, "Hey, we're nothing like a bank."
Yeah.
But the interesting part is when it comes down to application security, the variances are so small. So and again, everything's kind of in the report. You can go download it. If you look, financial services, it does better in things like compliance and regulation, which is obvious. That's what banks do, and software companies don't do that. And so the variances kind of make sense for the industry, but you're not talking about wildly different results. For the most part, yeah, kind of thinking through the 80-20 rule, about 80% of the stuff is just what application security programs should be doing.
So you would use this, say, to augment, if you're trying to be an ISO standard, you would want to see how, which things may be the more important things to implement at first if you don't have those things in place.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of companies, especially in the healthcare vertical, where they're already looking at frameworks like HIPAA and HITRUST, and they may be adopting ISO and your laundry list of letters and numbers. They don't go to the depth in this area that BSIMM does, and so they're very complementary. It isn't you don't adopt one or the other. It really is. I know that I have some gaps on the in my application security program. I can actually do a really deep dive by looking at the BSIMM.
Okay.
So I like the spider charts that you guys have, and when I look at the industry verticals, I see that healthcare is the smallest circle, which means it's doing the worst. I mean, and you only have 10 healthcare companies in that you've done research on. Give me a sense of those companies. I mean, overall it looks bad, but are there like a few bad apples in there that bring some great companies down and give them a bad reputation?
To kind of take a step back and just talk about the healthcare industry in its entirety. If you think about it, financial services is an actively regulated industry. So you have organizations like the OCC and the SEC always talking to banks about security, and it has naturally raised the bar. And if you look at software companies, and I'll pick on Microsoft only because they're so open about it, they had a bad run, and they were forced by the market to turn themselves around and really improve. And certainly there's a laundry list of other software companies that were kind of pushed in that direction. And then you look at the healthcare industry, and the regulators are very reactive. When something happens, they come in and take a look. And even where HIPAA audits have occurred, the percentage of organizations that got an audit is so small. So it's like losing the lottery. Your number got called. And so and I don't want to imply that healthcare companies don't care about this stuff, but they haven't been pushed as hard as all of these other verticals have, and certainly there's other manufacturing. Nobody's pushing them either. There's retail is kind of experiencing that new push where Target and Home Depot and other organizations had a breach, and they don't want to see themselves in the news. And healthcare is starting to see that too with Anthem and some of the others that have gotten breached. So they're just a little bit behind in maturity. If you think about where banks are, and if you think about where software companies are, healthcare is just, they're 5-10 years ago of how we looked at security, and they're catching up. So I don't want to imply that there are some really good ones out there and there's some really bad. I'm sure there are. But as an industry, they're just running behind, and I would actually use the analogy that they are sprinting to catch up. And in the next couple of years, I think we'll see that they're all on par.
That kind of leads to my next question. The companies that, I don't know, first of all, were they chosen for this? And what were the criteria? And secondly, are these like some of the better companies that are better at security companies? Or do you think it's a pretty good mix, a pretty good average to say this represents the vast majority of companies too. I mean, what kind of representation is it?
Yeah. So a couple things to think about on that. The BSIMM is an opt-in model, so companies have to basically say, "Hey, this is something we want to do." And so there's certainly the self-selection bias, but that's that kind of washes itself out after a while. I think again, to kind of talk about the healthcare vertical, there's so many different types of companies that fit in there. So there's your insurance company that insures the three of us. There's hospitals, there are pharmaceuticals, there are benefits managers, there are so many different companies that are in fact all being pushed in different directions. And so if you're in the hospital space, the two major players for software are Epic and Cerner. And so everybody is buying software predominantly from those two vendors. And you're not developing a lot of software. And so you wouldn't necessarily see a lot of hospitals wanting to go evaluate their application security program because they're not really developing any software. The flip side is that most of the insurance companies that you and I would potentially use, there's probably not a lot of off-the-shelf software. So they're developing massive amounts of software. Everything that you touch from that process is probably driven by a very customized software, which results in huge development shops, which can then be evaluated for application security. So it ends up being a real mix of organizations that get kind of thrown into the bucket just because of the nature of healthcare. And I'd say the same thing in financial services as well. It just so happens that almost every bucket in financial services is regulated, whether you're a hedge fund or you're doing insurance or straight up retail or commercial banking.
So the difference there, you had 67 firms in the version 5, you have 78 in version 6, but the healthcare and the consumer electronics are two new areas that you've added. Where is healthcare completely new, or is that were they interspersed in some of the other verticals? So
to actually do a breakout, you need a minimum, and I don't know what the minimum number of companies is to do the breakout.
Okay.
But the objective is not to go call out individual organizations, and so they've always tried to get enough that you could never reverse engineer the process. And so it's new to the extent that they finally reached that threshold where it can be reported like this.
Okay. So I'm Joe, CISO going into my company, and I found BSIMM, and I take it to my board and I go, okay, we should work to make this happen. And the first question they may ask me is, well, okay, what's the first thing we should do in this? I mean, there's a number of different sections that we could do with. What would be the first good place to start on this whole thing?
So, my opinion on it is a couple things. One, back to that original discussion of how to use the BSIMM is, so you have a whole list of things that you do, and then you have a whole list of things that the world is doing as well. Mm-hmm. And are there things that everybody in the world is doing that I'm not doing? Those kind of run up to the top, because then I have to ask myself, and by no means am I saying you should go do it just because everybody else is doing it. We're not lemmings. We're not all going to jump off the cliff. But you kind of have to ask yourself that question: am I purposefully not doing this thing? Am I doing this? Am I not doing it kind of with my eyes wide open? And so a lot of people say, yeah, this doesn't make sense for us. Spot on. You've done the analysis. You've looked at it. Don't go do it. But for a lot of people, it's like, wow, I didn't realize everybody was doing that. There's no reason we shouldn't be doing that. And so to me, those things rise to the top. And then, I start looking at the rest of my program and say, again, are there things that I'm doing that nobody else is doing? And maybe I'm not doing that purposefully. And so I'll stop doing some things. And then the third lens that I look at, for the BSIMM is, how can I get full coverage? So it's broken up into a bunch of different areas. I think they call it domains. Mm-hmm. And the idea is, if you think about how you got into application security, I will be incredibly stereotypical and say that pen testing is the first thing most organizations do when they get into application security. And so naturally, you kind of mature in pen testing. And for many organizations, they get really, really good at pen testing. But man, there's a whole lot of other things that you can do in application security. And so to kind of round yourself out, to do things like architecture and code review and all of the other things that exist in the application security space, is really to me kind of that next step of how do I do a little bit of everything in here, and kind of start maturing my program in that way.
Okay. So there's each section has a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3. Do you often come in, because you do consulting work for companies who want to implement this, right? That's what I understood.
Yeah. And I think the instinct is when I first saw this, I kind of viewed it as like a CMM maturity model. Mm-hmm. I want to get to 3, and that's totally not how you should look at it.
Okay.
It's more like college courses where there's your 100 levels. Those are I don't want to say they're easy for everybody to achieve, but they're certainly baseline. It's the intro class, and there are areas where you will move into the 200s, and the 300s are advanced. They are hard to do. And so if you went out and pulled the PDFs of every BSIMM we've ever done, or the BSIMM reports, the annual reports that get issued, if you go look at all of those reports, you'll see that there are some level 3 categories that got moved to level 2 and some level 2s that got moved to level 1. Mm-hmm. And what Cigital has done is they've recognized that there are some really hard things that actually got easier to do. And so they'll move them down and say, well, this is just easier. So by no means, and there's something like 110 different things that you can do. Nobody does 110 different things. The objective is not to get everything. It is not to get to be level 3 in every single area. It is really to mature, to look at all of those activities and say, this is the right things for me to be doing. And for some people, that includes, a lot of things in the 300 level course.
Do you ever go into a company and find that they've got some level 3 things, but their 2s and 1s aren't even filled out?
It's hard. They're supposed to build on each other. Sure. And so when I see that, it kind of begs the question, how could you leapfrog over something? So I don't want to say it's unheard of, but you really have to ask yourself how you're able to jump over. And again, just like everything I've kind of said, there may have been a very purposeful reason. A very, very simplistic example is level 2, a level 1 would be you have gates within your software development life cycle. And a 200 level would be you enforce those gates. Mm-hmm. Well, how are you going to enforce gates if you actually never created them? Yeah. So some of those things kind of naturally shake themselves out. But every once in a while, you're right. You see some witchcraft that they're creating, writing their own exploits, but they don't really have a pen test program. And usually there's some reason that came about that way.
Yeah, what jogged the question for me was in the governance tab. So level 1, you're identifying PII obligations and creating policy. Level 2, you've got a PII inventory, and then level 3, you're imposing policy on vendors. Usually, if you have a vendor, you're saying, make sure, our data is being shared properly. And then you find out, well, you're not even making sure your own data is being secured in your own environment in that way. So I was thinking, well, okay, if you're imposing policy on vendors to make sure that your PII and all your data that you give them is being stored as securely as possible, and you're not doing that yourself, it's kind of a hypocritical thing.
Yeah, and I'll mention it here too. I don't think we've actually said that the whole BSIMM model is open source. So bsim.com, you go download all of the information, and you'll see I think it's in the appendix of probably the PDF that you're looking at, is actually a much more detailed oriented description of each activity. Yeah. And I think a lot of people look at the titles, and certainly I did. First time I opened the document, I was like, I totally understand what that is. And I was just looking at the titles. And you got to go in and actually read what the expectation is, what is this activity about, to really kind of get an understanding of what they're talking about. So having had clients talk to me about what they think they're doing, a lot of times they're focused on the title of the activity versus actually what's deep inside the description. So as everybody out there is doing, if they're popping open the PDF right now and kind of going through it, run all the way to the bottom and actually start reading through the detailed activity in there.
Yeah. We actually did some of that for explanations because, like you, we were looking at the titles and I was like, well, I don't know what that means. And so we were running down through the bottom of these. So some verticals, some verticals in particular, they're all kind of middle of the road, like on page, what page am I on? 26, where it's talking about financial services firms seem to have a great, have a maturity, kind of like an even middle of the road thing. You mentioned that, HIPAA and high tech and all those have only been around for, I don't know, about 10 years now. The financials have been dealing with compliance and regulatory stuff, since the mid 80s, I think. So it's definitely more mature for them, but it's taken them that long just to get this far. And with healthcare being as not caught up as it should be, do you think that they're going to need to have bring in more people like you to help mature the industry?
Well, certainly, I hope so for my long-term career potential.
Sure. Absolutely.
But I think it's interesting. So if you think about a bank. And, my wife's credit card was used in Brazil earlier this week with a card present transaction, and her card is in her wallet. This fraud occurs and the bank reverses the transaction and life is good, right?
It's victimless.
The bank is the victim and it's built into their cost model and all is right in the world. Yeah. And healthcare organizations have it so much harder. So there's the transaction oriented aspect of some of the healthcare stuff. But in general, the PII contained in there can't be reversed. So if I find out that my boss has heart disease through a breach, nobody can take that back.
Yeah.
And so it's a bank has to secure things and builds applications and does a whole bunch of things based upon this concept of a transaction. While healthcare companies, I don't know if it's the right analogy, but besides doing the data in transit type of security things, the data at rest is really, really important and in fact can be really hard to do. So I wouldn't even say it's apples to apples, and healthcare companies are just a little bit behind. They're actually trying to tackle a much different problem or a much different type of thing that they're securing. It's going to take a whole lot more people, and I wouldn't be surprised today. My swag, unofficial, completely unscientific swag at employment would say that a majority of people are employed in security due to the financial service market. So that's not just working for banks, but working for people who supply things to banks. And I think we'll see a shift where healthcare, if it doesn't peak and make it the number one industry that we all work in, that it's a close number two, because they're really going to need a whole lot of security people to make this work. And unfortunately, my gut also says is this stuff is expensive, and I wouldn't be surprised if in 5 years somebody writes an article about how security made healthcare more expensive for all of us.
Yeah, I see a lot of parallels between healthcare and government. It's hard for. I know we had Mr. Martin Fisher on a couple of months ago, and he was talking about leadership and getting quality people in, and it's hard for him to get quality people because they can't pay industry, what the other people in the industry would get, and the government's the same way. So I mean, you're seeing the same data breaches in the government sector and then with OPM and all that you're seeing in very similarly in healthcare, because it's not there's a lack of talent, there's a lack of talent that want to work for pennies on the dollar that they know they can get elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think that that healthcare hasn't invested in this area, and so it isn't. I don't think they're just going to run out there and hire 100 people. They're going to hire 2, and then 6, and then 12, and you'll see kind of that hockey stick curve as they build up capabilities, because it's not driven the same way as some of the other industries have historically.
Right on.
So I mean, the flip side is, if you're sitting out there today, thinking about where you should take your career. I'm a huge advocate for application security. There are not enough. If you think the supply and demand curve is messed up in security, it is far more messed up in application security. So by all means, if you are a developer, go to OWASP and start learning the basics of security from OWASP. Go to BSIMM and learn the BSIMM methodology. Go learn all these things so you can be an AppSec guy. And kind of ancillary to that, if you're thinking about specializing in an industry, my gut says is that healthcare is a great industry to be focused on, and really learn what it's about. And I've spent a lot of time in the hospital side of healthcare. I've done medical devices, I've done hospitals, I've done the insurance companies, and they all have totally unique ways of doing things. And so there's some value in actually understanding the business model before you go jump into a security job at one of those places.
Yeah, I would say with healthcare, you've definitely got to be patient, because there's a lot going on there other than just, information security. The doctors add a lot to that little issue. So
patient, that's
patience for your patients. Yes. Yes.
Jay, something you said earlier, you said, my question was, do the people who get into this BSIMM and audit themselves or whatever, or have you guys audit them, are they better than average? Or are they better than, their peers as far as application security? And you said it kind of, rounds itself out. But then in the BSIMM version 6 report, round 1 versus round 2, it looks like overall the companies who have had a second round of BSIMM have improved greatly. How can you say that they're, they come in with a good representation of most companies out there, yet it looks to me like they take security more seriously, and even in their second round, because of the visibility that they got from BSIMM, in my opinion, they've improved year over year.
Great question. So Gary McGraw is the author and CTO at Cigital of the report. And if you go to YouTube, there's probably like 7 presentations, and many of the presentations say that there's one requirement for having an application security program. The bare minimum is somebody has to be in charge. And so to do a BSIMM measurement, it is incredibly hard to do one if nobody is in charge. So first and foremost, everybody that gets measured, somebody is in charge. And maybe, and I think some of the statistics are in the document you guys are looking at. Some of the organizations may be one person. Some of the organizations may be, multiple times that number. But you have to have a one to be measured. And so that, right off the bat, there are so many organizations today where nobody is in charge of application security. It's nobody's job. And, there's the joke, if it's nobody's job, then nobody's doing it. And so there's that's kind of when I implied the self-selection criteria. That pool is made up of people where at least one person is in charge. And I've seen people use the BSIMM for a number of different ways. Sometimes it is truly a benchmark where they've been building out a program for a number of years and they want to see where they fall. And other times people really, it's a great kind of tool when you first walk into an organization, brand new to the organization, and say, hey, tell me what's going on here so I know what I need to do next. And so that when I talk about, kind of rounding out the data pool, is that so many people come into it for so many different reasons that you will find people that really are starting off in application security. It's a brand new, that first guy, that number one person he just needs to get a benchmark of what am I doing here so I know what to do next, versus, organizations which have been doing stuff in application security for quite a while, and they just want to know, hey, am I doing the right things? How does this compare to everybody else? Show me where I'm at this point in process. And I kind of use the example, and every once in a while an executive freaks out when I say it. Application security programs take about 3 years at least to build. And, I've had guys come back to me and say, hey, Jay, what can we do in 90 days? We could do most of it in 90 days. But the reality is it takes about 3 years. And so some people are doing the measurement a couple months in, and some people are doing the measurement 3 years in. And certainly there are some people who are doing the measurement 20 years in. So that kind of hopefully explains where all the data comes from and why it shows up like that.
So that guy who comes in, and he wants to know how to get that work, what benefit do they get out of it? I know we talked before we started recording that my company was approached by a company because we're trying to get into a relationship with them, and they wanted to know how we were applying the BSIMM to our environment. So we had to basically scramble and put in how everything maps, because we're ISO compliant and all this stuff. We're trying to figure out how everything maps to one another. Is it just purely a business thing? Do companies want to see that others are using it, or is it just something that when a company reaches a certain level of maturity, they think they need to use this to get further?
Yeah, I mean there's a how do I start the conversation? I think a lot of companies who really believed in the BSIMM obviously don't develop all their own software. And so let's just make up a number and say I develop 80% of my software in-house, and then I use a whole bunch of contractors to do it outside. And so you go and you evaluate what you do in-house, and there's certainly some activities in the BSIMM that talk about how you deal with contractors. But the reality is if it's important to me in-house, it should be important to all of these vendors. And so Cigital came up with a subset of the BSIMM activities that is just for vendors. And so that I'm guessing that you might be looking at the full BSIMM. You could also be looking at the subset that says, as a vendor, you should really be doing these couple things. Could you let me know, are you doing this stuff? And it's kind of extending, I as much as I think a lot in manufacturing terms. And so it's kind of that software supply chain. I get software from you, and in fact, you're subcontracting it to some other guy, and he hired another contractor. And so you have to evaluate the whole supply chain of software. And so certainly if you're sitting here today with a kind of a beginning application security program, I'm not saying you should go adopt the full supply chain. Start with what you develop today, and then kind of work your way around. But the flip side is true, is that a lot of people might be listening and saying, hey, Jay, I don't even write any software. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't care about how others write software. And a lot of corporations historically have used this idea of a pen test as the way to evaluate the software. And that's great. But that's a very point in time view of how security was done. And the idea of looking at some of these BSIMM activities is that it's not that point in time. I'm actually doing the right things. And so, yeah, maybe there's going to be a vulnerability in the next application, the next version of the application I release. But it's from a risk-based perspective, all of the right things are in place. And so theoretically, I should actually find that vulnerability as part of my process.
Cool. So you've been a consultant for integrating this into software development life cycles for applications. You mentioned I'm looking at your bio here, and you mentioned agile development. Is implementing BSIMM for application security different in the different types of development life cycles? So if you're using waterfall, for example, is it different to implement in, say, agile, or there's another one? There's another one I'm thinking of. Maybe those are the only two major ones I know of, agile and waterfall.
DevOps. Kind of the next
DevOps.
evolution. DevOps. Yeah.
So how would you implement BSIMM in those different things? Let's do DevOps, for instance, because that's kind of near and dear to my heart.
So would you mind if I go on a little soapbox here?
Please soapbox it.
So here's my beef: is nothing changes at all philosophically. And in fact, most people are doing broken things under a waterfall model, and waterfall is so slow that you can kind of work your way through it. Great example is you do a pen test very late in the software development lifecycle, and it's a 9-month development process. And so you can, in fact, wait. You can go fix those vulnerabilities, and you have a whole lot of time to do a whole lot of different things, and it's no big deal. And you get to Agile, and you start to feel the pain a little bit more because things are going so fast. And DevOps, blows the whole thing out of the water because it's lightning fast. So I don't think about it as application security programs should be different philosophically at the philosophical level, whether it's waterfall, Agile, or DevOps. In fact, the difference is that a waterfall model, security can own a whole lot more of the processes because that interaction occurs so slowly between the two organizations, development and security, that things go okay. And when you go to the extreme of DevOps, they can't be two separate organizations. And if you go and look at the BSIMM stands for Building Security and Maturity Model, is the only way you can get DevOps application security to work is in fact by building it in, working together. The security person has to be part of that team. And if I can pitch a blog post that I wrote. If you go to jschulmann.com, you type in DevOps in the search bar, you will find this kind of soapbox dissertation on my beliefs on integration. And too many people look at it as two distinct organizations. And when you move to DevOps, it isn't. And I think what we'll find kind of as we go through the next couple of years is that application security today predominantly, although I see it a couple times as exceptions, predominantly is in the security organization. And I think what we'll see is kind of a movement into the application development world where I won't be surprised where a lot of application security people report into the VP of development, because in DevOps, as a great example, they have to work together. They have to be at the table. They have to be in sync. And we're not, as a security practice, a profession, we're just not used to operating like that. And I think that's the struggle that most people have. And hopefully I didn't offend you on your question, but it's a question I get so often. And I just think that as security people, we just start having to think very differently about it.
Yeah, no, that's cool. It's interesting because every organization that I've ever been to, the gold standard was trying to be ISO compliant, but everybody was trying to shoehorn themselves into the ISO standard. So it was interesting to hear your take on, not every company is going to be able to implement BSIMM the same way, I just find that refreshing. That it's pretty much the same for all those. So it's going to make it a lot easier for a lot of companies to implement this.
Yeah, and I think that it's probably a mistake when you think about an ISO standard, and I'm probably talking heresy here, that it's written on paper, so we have to follow it. Yeah. I think that there's some rationalization, and I'm grateful that the folks at Cigital kind of believe in that rationalization philosophy around the BSIMM. It's about thinking through what makes sense for you, not it's a checklist and we need to go follow all these checklist things. And I think it's the same thing with a lot of things. And it's probably more about explaining it to regulators, and people don't want to explain it, so we might as well just go do it and not worry about it.
So when you're following BSIMM, what happens if there's something you just don't do or can't do? Can you get waivers for them so that you can still say, yeah, I'm mostly BSIMM compliant, or is it just like we're this shade of BSIMM? We're not completely BSIMM, but we're BSIMM, this far on this, or we're this mature in this area. Is that how it works? We're just this mature in this area, and we can't get any higher.
I wouldn't even. It's I'm just picturing a stoplight, like you got green, yellow, or red, and that's before we started recording. We were talking about metrics, and that's like my least favorite way to report metrics is by color. But yeah, it's not a if you think about it in terms, and you kind of brought it up that the reason you got kind of engaged in the BSIMM thing is as a vendor or in that supply chain process. It's not meant to be a red, yellow, green. It's really meant for an application security analyst who's using you guys as a vendor in that supply chain to say, what's their risk profile look like as they develop software. And my gauge on that is, if you're doing all of the right things, maybe I, as a company consuming that software, don't have to do every single solitary process as that code comes in. I can trust it a little bit more, versus you do nothing. I have to actually put in a whole bunch of controls because I know that you don't have those in place. And so I kind of use it in that manner. I have to be honest, I haven't seen how every single company has used the vendor component to it, but that's kind of how I would envision it.
Could a company use it and say, okay, well, we're going out for code development and these are not code development. This company is going to be doing code reviews for us. So, we're using the BSIMM. We want them to use the BSIMM. They need to be at least this level of maturity before we can say, yes, they're good to go. Like the government requires CMMI level 3, usually for most contractors. Could you say, you know what, we'd like them to be at least, CMMI or BSIMM level 2 on intelligence, and, they need to be 3 on governance. Can you do something like that?
I think that you would look at the set of activities and say, these 6 activities are really important to us. And so if you're not doing them, show me a plan for how you would implement that, or explain why that's absolutely not impossible, or that's impossible. I also think you have to recognize that people go into this process or use vendors for different reasons. And so I can buy commercial off-the-shelf software and want to understand how that's built. So, I'm just picking a random Microsoft Office, right? That's commercial off-the-shelf software. Mm-hmm. I could have a SaaS product, Gmail, that, and the challenge there with that pen test model, and that's a great example of why looking at this holistically is much better than doing a pen test. Gmail, every once in a while I get this little pop-up that says, hey, Gmail's been updated. You should refresh your screen. But the fact is, I don't really see the updates. And so I really am relying upon how they develop software to know whether it's secure or not. And then there's that, truly outsourced development model where a company could be writing code and sending me a finished product that I use that was completely customized, or I'm using developers the same way as I use my employees, where they write code and I suck it in. And so all of those different models kind of have to take a different philosophy for protecting security. So the COTS model, right? Microsoft's only going to give you so much information, and so you have to deal with that. Sure. And I'm not picking on, every software company is going to be like that. And the contract developer that I bring on board might be using my company laptop, might be using all of these different things, but do I have a process in place to make sure that person isn't putting malware or backdoors or things like that as they write the code? So all of those different things kind of take on different activities within the BSIMM that you'd want to think about in terms of your application security program.
Very cool. All right.
Jay, 100% of the, I guess, the best scoring 10 companies have a satellite, and 0% of the lowest scoring companies in BSIMM do not have a satellite. Can we talk about satellites, what they are, and why that's such a shocking number?
You're just picking all the soapboxes tonight. Yeah, satellites is a great example. It fits entirely into kind of that DevOps discussion that we were just having. Right. And so, kind of 2 phenomena I see all the time. Hey, Jay, we need more application security people. I can't find them. Can you help find us some? And the other is, how could I possibly have enough application security people to cover all of the different development groups that I have around the country, around the world, within my organization, what have you. And so the idea of a satellite is extending the reach of that core group of application security people. So I'm just going to use pretend round numbers to make life easy here and say that I have 5 application security consultants on staff in my company, and I have 10,000 developers. That doesn't scale. And so the idea of a satellite is to take people within the development organization and make it part of their job to think about security on an everyday basis. And that may be 20% of their job. It may be 50% of their job, but kind of push that capability out into the field, out to where code is developed. And one of the really important concepts that when I think about satellites is that it's kind of a two-way street. You have to, it's not just about pushing information out, but also being able to get feedback back from the field. And that's that concept of satellite. And if you think about the struggles that you may be having in an application security program today, my guess is that either your satellite you don't have one, it's not big enough, it's not engaged. Being able to kind of touch so much of your development group that way just can be incredibly powerful.
Very cool.
And let's talk about strategy. I mean, how does one build a satellite program? I mean, I don't know. Is there some reference materials? Is there a book I can buy and say, here's how you do it? I mean,
you're giving me a great idea for my next book. It's probably far too complex to just soapbox here. And certainly Cigital, not to go promote a consulting firm here, but Cigital absolutely knows how to do it. I think that the challenge, the first place you have to ask yourself as to whether you can even do it is, what is the relationship that you have with the development organization? And so many people probably read that satellite concept, written in the BSIMM and probably talked about elsewhere, and they're like, man, they won't take my phone call. How am I going to get a satellite if they won't take my phone call? And so, there's a whole lot to do to go build out a satellite program, but let's just start with developing a really good relationship with my client, my customer, in the development organization. And so let's start there. And if you already have a fantastic relationship, then start thinking about the satellite concept. But for so many security organizations that I talk to, it's a fight. They're not getting along. They're fighting about SLAs and fixing vulnerabilities and things like that. So to kind of focus just on developing a relationship, if you're going to ask them for 10 resources with 20% of their time, and you guys aren't getting along, it doesn't matter what the book says on how to build a satellite. You're not there yet.
Mr. Betcher, do you have any other questions?
Well, Jay, if you would, I'd like to change topics a little bit. You said at the beginning of the cast that you're all about education, right? How do we get better at educating people on cybersecurity? I mean, and I see that there are some schools now, because of the need, they're offering cybersecurity programs. Do you, in your opinion, do you think that's a good thing, or are they doing it wrong? Where should the pipeline of the next wave of security professionals come from? Should they get a computer science degree and then spend 5 years supporting an IT organization before they move into security as like another level? Or should they get a cybersecurity degree and just jump right into security?
Yeah, I mean, fantastic question, and I'm certainly very opinionated on it. I think that I'm certainly very happy that organizations, ranging from Coursera, where you can go get a whole wide range of security classes for free today, to I don't know that I said that I'm here in Chicago. DePaul University has both I think they have a bachelor's. I know they have a master's in information security, so you can go get an advanced degree in this topic, which is great. I think that as I think about how I grew up, and I'll plug myself for a second. I created this podcast as part of the educational effort where I go through and I interview people about how what was their career journey look like, and really talented security people have a tinkering aspect to it. And so I'm fearful when you strip out all of the tinkering aspects of technology and head right into security, that you're missing that mindset. And so, if I go back to, hopefully my mom is not going to listen to this podcast. If I go back to my home life way back when, I unscrewed the phone jack and started playing around with the wires because I wanted to learn how it worked.
Well, who hasn't?
Right. Well, and good security people historically, because of how we were brought up, do. And I have built so many PCs in my time. I have so many broken things in my house because I said, oh, I can fix it. And then I actually think I can fix it. I just can't actually get it back together because they were put together so goofily. And that to me is a lost art. And I don't care what your background is. I do not have a computer science degree, and I think that I've been pretty successful in security. So I don't feel like you have to come out of a CS school and do this. In fact, I think there are fabulous people that just play at night on all this stuff and learn it and are phenomenal at it. So to me, it's the passion. If you come into this thinking that, if you look at the employment statistics and the salaries are high and the supply and demand makes it really easy to get a job, if you're just here because you think it's easy to get a job, I don't think that's a good career move. I don't think you're going to be successful in this industry because you have to be passionate. You have to have that tinkering aspect. The number one question, if anybody listening to this ever interviews with me, I will give you the hardest question I ask, which is, what are you passionate about? And the reason I ask that is that so much of what we do as a security profession occurs not from the formal education, but the fact that this industry just changes so much over time. And you have to be reading at night. You have to be tinkering. You have to go pick up, and I hate to use the awful word, an Internet of Thing, and go play with it and see how it works. And if you're not passionate with that stuff, it's going to be hard for you to keep up. So I don't know if I directly answered the question, but that's kind of my philosophy on the whole education aspect of it.
No, that's awesome. I interviewed a couple of people. I told you about the gentleman we just recently hired at our organization. One of the questions I asked him and a couple of other folks was, what do you do in your off time? What are you doing when you're not at work? And we had one guy, and I apologize, sir, if you're listening to the podcast, but I'm going to tell you what the answer should have been instead of the answer you gave me. He said, I have I was like, what do you do in your off time? Do you, go to ISSA meetings or ISAC or something? He's like, well, I travel a lot, and, I got this dog that I've been taking care of, and it takes up a lot of my time. And, I got my girlfriend, and I was like, okay. And I was
I'll compare, my best answer to that was astronomy. And I was like, how about something like within the realm of security?
Yeah.
And we paused for a while, and he's like, can I get back to you on that one? I was like, absolutely. So we circled around at the end of the interview. He's like, Jay, all I can come up with is astronomy. And it was, it's exactly as you pointed out. It's interesting. I don't know. I certainly never got to spend a lot of time with this individual, but I wondered whether he was really passionate about this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I wondered about that too. Cause I was like, do you read any books? Do you like podcasts? I mean, do you do anything, other than work and go home? And he was like, yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know if it was the job he was in currently, didn't allow him for a lot of free time maybe or something, but he could have at least said, cause he's I don't listen to podcasts cause I don't really, remember a lot of what they told me in there. So I was like, oh wow, that's kind of a
You didn't know I was a podcaster, did you? Before
I didn't even bother telling him. I was like, I don't want him to know because I always look up people. I research people before I do the interview, so I know a little bit about them. I knew you had a podcast, and I knew that you were a BSIMM guy, and so I always research. Even the people I was interviewing, I was researching them, And he could have at least said, "Oh, well, I'd listen to your pod, something, anything," but he just didn't give me anything, and I was like, man, I can't consider him because that's all he does, so that was just me. Other people interviewed him as well. So Mr. Butcher, do you have any other questions? Because we have.
I do. Just a real quick one.
Okay.
Jay, you said your wife had her credit card pop. Was that chip and pin?
It was chip and pin.
Oh God.
And it was card present.
And it was card present.
That is.
It was funny. So if you go back and look at the calendar, her card was taken about 3 days before Brian Krebs published an article on Landry's restaurant group, and so I sent her the list of Landry restaurants and said, "Hey, have we eaten there since July?" And we couldn't come up with one. I mean, we didn't go through the credit card receipts and go dig it out, but it didn't instinctively come up. But my guess, I got my personal card was taken 2 days before Thanksgiving in the year that the Target breach occurred. I've always been able to tie them back. Kudos to Brian Krebs. Whenever he publishes the breach article, my card usually was 2 or 3 days behind it. I'm assuming that we probably hit one of those restaurants.
Wow. Yeah, that card present. That's even bad with the EMV, because I was like, I'm just happy to have my first EMV. My credit union, Navy Federal, just finally got EMV chip cards sent out to people. So it kind of sucks that they're already finding ways around the technology that we've taken decade to get implemented. So.
Well, and I'm surprised too, kind of as a side note, how many places I go into that have chip and pin readers that aren't enabled. Yeah. And so, and I think that, kind of the fallacy of this whole system is I can have chip and pin. I can even be standing in front of a chip and pin reader, and it's not operational yet.
Yeah. And, you trying to tell the guy behind the counter, hey, if anything ever happens to the credit cards in your business, you're going to be held responsible. He doesn't care. He doesn't run. Normally, he's not the guy running the business. So he's like, oh, okay.
The very first chip and pin reader I found was actually at a Jimmy John's. And I was so excited. I pulled out my phone to take a picture of it. And they totally freaked out. What are you doing? Why are you taking a picture of our card reader? I was like, I'm just excited to see one. And I thought they were going to walk me out of the restaurant.
I was actually told by the lady at Starbucks, the barista behind the counter, she doesn't like them because they take longer to run through than just swiping the cards.
I won't pick on the actual retailer that does it, but I actually questioned how they could have picked that chip and pin reader because it was so slow that there has to be a true cost in going to chip and pin. And I couldn't believe it. You sit there for 30 seconds and I've seen much, much faster chip and pin readers. So that was a little bizarre to me.
Yeah, that
amazing that they had one at Jimmy John's. I mean, did they have your sandwich ready before you even got to the chip and pin reader, and they had to sit there and wait for a minute?
I will credit Jimmy John's here.
Kind of ironic.
That even without chip and pin, with just swipe, it's probably a race to see who's going to be finished first, my sandwich or the swipe of the credit card.
Yeah. Well, they were one of the businesses that got owned, I think, after Target. So I'm not surprised that they implemented chip and pin. My wife got a chip and pin Target card, and it works great for her system, So it's pretty awesome. So Jay, if people wanted to get a hold of you, how would they do that?
They can go to jayschulman.com, JAYSCHULMAN.com. Okay. I kind of mentioned it earlier. I created the website totally as kind of like a volunteer effort as I saw people answering questions as astronomy to kind of help people grow their career. I have since written a book, created the podcast, and done a whole lot of other things, and routinely get on a soapbox on an occasional Monday or Wednesday and rant about stuff. So if it's of interest to you, certainly love to have you check out the website. It is an absolute passion project for me, and I've been had so much fun. I think coming up on a year now doing it.
Very cool. We'll have a link to the website, and you're also doing a podcast. So the podcast link is on the website as well.
It is, and the book is on there. You can probably just Google my name and come up with a whole bunch of different things, as well as a dentist in New York that I can't seem. He has got really good search engine optimization.
Well, they are dentists. They are the most hated of the doctor types.
He's trying to make money. I'm not trying to make money, so it's probably all good.
Right on. Mr. Betcher, how do people get a hold of you in the new year?
in the new year.
The new year.
I
You killed me, dog.
I haven't changed my Twitter handle like you so passionately want me to, but yes, I'm on Twitter, so just DM me or whatever on there. I'm at BetYourPwned.
Right on. The official Breaking Down Security podcast Twitter is at BrakeSec, BRAKE Sec. Mine is at Brian Brake, BRYANBRAKE. We're on the Twitters. We're on Facebook. We have a Facebook fan page if you want to follow that, facebook.com/BreakingDownSec with my last name. We have a LinkedIn group, such as it is. It's got like 16 people in it. You don't have to follow it if you don't want to. We're on iTunes. If you do download on iTunes, we'd love some feedback. We got some more feedback on there. That was awesome. Thank you for the people who joined that. We have a Patreon. We believe in the value for value model. So if you find value in what you're getting from our hour-long talk here with Jay, please, go over there and hook us up with a few bucks. It doesn't cost you much. It's like $1 a month, or you can go up to as much as you want. We're still going to probably donate the majority of it or all of it to Hackers for Charity, like we did last year. So you can go and do that. And we like to leave stuff on there too. Sometimes we like to add the audio plus or minus the podcast to let you get a little behind the scenes, if you will. We're also on the TuneIn app. If you don't want to do an RSS feed or something, we're on TuneIn app, which is the internet radio app. You can go and search for us there and listen to every episode we've ever done, all the way back to 2014. So that was really awesome for them to allow us to be on their product. So thank you, Jay, for coming on, and thank you as always, Mr. Betcher, for being here with me.
Thank you, guys. A lot of fun.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Yep, that was it. Have a great week, everyone. We'll see you soon.